started the Tafsir, the commentaries, the reflections upon the Quran, with the short surah, because as in the case with the previous surah, Humaza, and the other short surahs that we have done so far, most of these surahs were revealed in the Meccan period, in the early part of the message. And the common theme with these surahs, you will notice that there is a paradigm shift. It is as if it is grabbing the attention of human beings to something beyond their physical existence. And I believe that this was a part of the great power of the transformative power of the Islamic message for many of the early Muslims, and one hopes that we engage the Quran in the same way. So Surah al Qaria, and the translated in the Tafsir that I have, or in the translation that I have here, is a crashing blow, but you will find that it's translated in other ways as well. In a very powerful melodic verses, it grabs the attention and alerts you to a paradigm shift. And the paradigm shift that we are talking about is accountability, the ultimate confrontation with al-mizan, with a judgment and balance, consequences, and with the hereafter, that it is not just this life, but that this life is a means to an end. It is a path to a goal. There is an objective that, and this is critical because in many ways Islam didn't come to replace the ethical values of humanity. As the Prophet ﷺ said when he says that I came to perfect the ethics of people, it is not that as a Muslim we have a different set of ethics than other human beings. It is the same set of morals and ethics, the same aspiration towards justice. However, supplemented with a very important paradigm shift, and that is not ethics for the purpose of ethics, not morals for the sake of morals, but that there is judgment and consequence. And the way that in Surah al Qaria we are alerted to this, the Quran calls the final day, other than al-akhirah, or the hereafter, it has certain descriptive words like Qara, or like Halaqa in another surah, Surah al-Halaqa, where it is the final day, al-akhirah, is given a descriptive term. Now, Qara, the word is impactful, frightening, grabs your attention at many levels, because qara' al-shay is to beat something, to beat it, to even, or to shake it, to thunder it. All of that could fit within qara'. And some of the commentators said that the hereafter was described as a qari'a لأنها تقرأ قلوب, that it will set the hearts asunder. Now, this is all within a theme repeated in the Quran, and that is when the hereafter comes, it will be a moment that truly shakes all human beings to the core. I had a friend who would say that his dream is to exist when the hereafter arrives. Well, in Islamic theology, we will all exist when the hereafter arrives. But that transformative moment where reality will change from the material, physical laws that exist that we are all familiar with to an entirely different set of reality within a completely different dimension. I'm among those who do not believe that we continue to exist in the same dimension when reality alters. The physical laws that we know are physical laws because they are within this plane of existence, but they do not limit Allah. It's, when you read modern physics and they talk about that the cosmos itself is as if contained within a bubble, and there are other cosmos that exist at different planes, or that now they theorize that the physical laws are only pertinent and relevant as long as they're within a certain cosmos, a certain dimension. There is so much in the Quran that alerts us to that thundering moment where everything is going to change. All reality will alter. And the word here, qara, something that sets asunder, something that shakes, something that crashes, in a crashing blow. Now, وَمَا الْقَارِعَةُ, it's in interrogative form, and how can you know what qari'ah is? Now, again, most commentators say that these verses are addressing the Prophet. I am from those who believe that the verses are not addressed to the Prophet but addressed to humanity. And an acknowledgement of the fact that regardless of how much we try to conceptualize or imagine that transformative moment will and truly terrifying moment where the reality as we know it will transform. Regardless of how much we try to imagine it, we cannot know it. We cannot imagine it. And there consistently, you'll find that theme in the Quran, that whether it's addressed to the Prophet or addressed to all human beings, saying, and how can you possibly know how that moment is going to be like? In the Quran, often Allah describes to us in descriptive term what that moment is going to be like, but consistently it also acknowledges that we cannot truly understand what it's going to be like because until we experience it. But if you are a Muslim, you believe that the yaqeen that you're supposed to work towards, the certitude that you're supposed to work towards, is the certitude of knowing that experiencing it, you will. That there is no way around experiencing it. That as a matter of faith, we believe we will, in fact, as all of humanity, will experience it. So, Surah al Qaria, mal Qaria, the question form, what is the Qaria? وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا الْقَارِعَةُ. The Quran often uses this style of saying, of posing the question and then saying, and how can you know what it is? Because you have not experienced it. And true knowledge of the gripping reality is going to become, the gripping fear, the gripping tension that is going to become, will not be achieved until you experience it. But again, I remind you that belief, faith, is the certitude that you will experience it. Because often Muslims, the part where you find the ethics of a human being disintegrating, as the Prophet ﷺ says, that you do not commit a sin when you are truly a believer. That every time you sin, you don't really sin as a Muslim. Because at the moment you sin at a times when your Muslim faith becomes compromised to one degree or another. In other words, when you sin, in fact, at that moment, you somehow put on fogs, you put on shades between that conviction that the truly terrifying moment of accountability will come. Because if you truly remember that moment of accountability at the instant that you sin, you wouldn't do it. You just wouldn't do it. It would be unthinkable. But we are very good at self-deception, and we are very good at believing something and then using all types of maneuvers to create a distance between us and what we even in the bottom of our hearts believe. We do this even when we deal with other human beings. I mean, we could truly love a human being, and in our bottom of our hearts love a human being. But at moments of anger, at moments of anxiety, at moments of selfishness, we treat the other human being unfairly. And at that moment in which we treat the other human being unfairly, our love is not where it should be. We dilute that love. Because if it is, duna sha'iba, as they used to say, if it exists without compromise in its pristine form, you wouldn't be unfair to the person you love. Their feelings would be yours. You would do unto them as you would like done unto yourself. But think of every time that you've treated someone unfairly. At that moment, your ability to conceptualize what is it to be them is compromised. Similarly with faith. When it comes to sin, at the moment that we sin, we obfuscate our realization of a qara. And that's why Allah always tells us, always poses that question, وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا الْقَارِعَةُ. If you could only internalize the awareness of that moment that will come inevitably in your existence, the afterlife that is a reality, as much of a reality as the physical reality that you exist in, undeniable. Everything will transform. But Allah also knows that our nature is that we compromise what we believe in, and at the moment that we compromise it, our belief itself is compromised. So, a qari'ah, what is a qari'ah? How will you know, or how could you know what is a qari'ah? By the way, a qari'ah is used elsewhere in the Quran, where Allah, for instance, says, وَلَا يَزَالَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا تُصِيبُهُم بِمَا صَنَعُوا قَارِعَةً. That elsewhere in the Quran, a qari'ah is used with the connotation of a fall or a calamity, a disaster. As in the verse that I cited, I mean, it's maybe inshallah we'll get to it eventually, but just as a footnote, if you will, that in this surah it's qari'ah, and in Islamic theology, when you say a qari'ah or you say a halaqa, is understood that you are referring to the hereafter, but the word can also mean a calamity or a fall or an injustice sometimes, depending on the context in which you use the word. Okay, and then the description of that day of a qara, that knocking day, that crashing day, that day in which nothing it cannot escape the attention of any living being. And imagine the early Muslims. I mean, again, sometimes I wish I could experience Islam as a convert, to know the impact of these verses heard as an adult. Because when you're raised with them, your senses become dulled. You know, you're raised, you memorize Surah al Qaria when maybe in school. But part of the problem is that you memorize it, and then later on you start thinking about the words, but by then your senses have become dulled. And language in itself is a powerful creator. Now, the remarkable thing about the Quran is that it came among poets, among a culture of poetry, and yielded that language in a way that grabbed the attention of early Muslims in truly transformative ways. So when the first description of the day of Al-Qari'ah, and if you notice I keep using the Arabic word because I'm not quite satisfied with any of the translations, not crashing to blow, not day of calamity. Does anyone else have a translation with them?
Noise and clamor.
Clamor is perhaps another way. Again, language creates reality and manipulates and engages reality. And so when you say the word qari'ah in Arabic, it's as if you feel the very waves of space around you is affected by it. Very differently than if you say crashing blow or calamity or what did you say, Sharif?
Noise and clamor.
Clamor. That's part of the power of language and the power of using the Arabic itself. This in reference to something I said last Halaqa. People will say, well, why do we pray in Arabic? Because language itself transforms reality and engages wavelengths around you. And like Aramaic, like many of the ancient languages, their vocalization, or like Hebrew, is another language that has a remarkable power upon the very atmosphere around you. English does, but in a different way. Yeah, that's a different question. Okay, so the first description is يوم يكون الناس كالفراش المبثوث. My translation says that on the day when people will be scattered like moths, which is a good translation as any. The main addition that I would put to this is that al-farash, there in commentaries there's a lot of discussion of what is it, when it says farash, does it refer to moths, does it refer to bees, does it refer to birds? It doesn't really matter, because what we can all agree on is that the analogy it's drawing, the picture that it's trying to give you, is that human beings will be in an utter state of confusion, fluttering around purposely. Descriptive of the gripping fear of that moment. And that the reaction of human beings will be to run around, exactly like they run around, if you've ever seen human beings when a volcano explodes or when there's an earthquake, they go left and right, they clash into each other. Some of the best commentaries on this is that, consistent with what the Quran says elsewhere, by the way, that even a mother or a father will become distracted from their own children, that human beings will be in great numbers, running in every direction and even clashing into each other. If you're interested in the Arabic, the al-mabthuth, the commentators say al-mabsut al-mutafarriq alladhi yajul ba'dahu fi ba'd. That they will literally clash into each other. Elsewhere in the Quran, human beings are described in the at that moment where the hereafter begins as sakara wa ma hum bisakara, as if they're drunk, but they're not drunk. Again, descriptive of the general state of confusion and fear and anxiety that will exist at that moment. Now, drawing a very powerful image, what is the reason for that state of confusion? It is not simply earthquakes or volcanoes, but indicative of the transformation of the very reality we live in. And how does the Quran tell us that? وَتَكُونُ الْجِبَالُ كَالْعِهْنِ الْمَنْفُوشِ. Mountains, العهن المنفوش. عهن is like not fiber, wool, or something that you weave together, like wool or threads. Manfush, scattered around. So elsewhere, the Quran always reminds us that Allah has made the mountains steady and solid. And in fact, the Quran told us that the mountains anchor the very crust of the earth. That the Jibal have been created by Allah as rawasi, as anchors. Anchors to what? In modern science, we understand that they're anchors to the crust of the earth. And remarkably, it's one of those things that early Muslims puzzled about. In what ways are mountains anchors? Modern Muslims said, aha, well, that's what it's referring to, so on and so forth. But the contrast here is contrary to the nature of mountains in our existence, in our material existence. Suddenly these mountains become like threads that are being scattered around. The very nature of the reality changes. Now, if you imagine the nature of your reality melting, we know that reality is made of vibrations. But interestingly, even our forefathers, the ones who were scientifically inclined, suspected that atoms vibrate. And today we know that in fact all of reality is made of vibrations, and that these vibrations are calculated meticulously to construct the reality that we perceive. We also know from modern physics that something, a quartz, the smaller level of reality, does not have a location until observed. That quartzes can exist in multiple places, and this is how the idea of multiple dimensions came to be. And then they figured out the math. Physics, modern physics, is actually quite really interesting to read, right? But then one of the most remarkable things is that we discovered that when you send photons through prisms, that in fact they go through, a photon will go through several prisms, a single photon, and seem to multiply itself to go through several prisms, not settling on a location until observed. So, as many whether social scientists or actual physical scientists, reality is constructed. And the modern intellect understands that. Well, imagine that reality becoming reconstructed right before your eyes, the entire artificiality of the difference between a chair and me, as defined by the wavelengths of the molecules in a chair and the molecules in my body, becoming completely altered. If that is not a Qaria, and it's perfect term. I mean, if you truly try to think of another term, it's very hard to think of one. If that's not a qari'ah, if that's not something that shakes your very foundation, it's hard to imagine what else would. And so humans are in confusion as the mountains themselves scatter like threads. The very nature of their magnanimous solid state becomes vaporized. Just reviewing if I've missed anything in my... Okay. No, I haven't. Okay. So, the first 5, and in the short surahs of the Quran, you will often find the structure. The first 5 verses will describe a state. Remaining 6 will tell you the consequence of the state. If you reflect upon the short surahs, you will often find that structure maintained. The first 5 or 6 verses will describe a state. The next 5, 6, 10, 12 verses will tell you the consequence of a state. So, after that short, powerful description, Surah al Qaria moves swiftly to the consequences. Those whose scales are heavy, فَأَمَّا مَنْ ثَقُلَتْ مَوَازِينُهُ, those whose scales are heavy, فَهُوَ فِي عِيشَةٍ رَاضِيَةٍ, they are in a tranquil or pleasing or sanguine life. So after that brief state of anxiety, after the realization that reality is transforming, that physical reality is transforming, because their scales are heavy, a sense of peace and repose sets in. The Isha Radiya will herald the hereafter of salvation in the English language. One of the most interesting things about the scholars that commented about ثَقُلَتْ مَوَازِينُهُ, you know that the theme of the mizan, the balance, is an often used theme in the Quran. And we've talked about the importance of the balance as a secret of creation and also as a secret of the hereafter. That meticulous balance in our modern minds, but also interestingly, by the way, among even our earlier scientists, as I talked about last time, some who reflected on the equations that the equations of creation. We know that certain numbers or certain equations describe our entire reality. And as the theory of the Higginbotham theorem told us, that you come and you change, even you tweak around in just a few numbers of that equation and our entire reality becomes undone. That theme of the mizan, whether as the secret of creation or the secret of the hereafter, of justice in the hereafter, and Allah constantly hearkening us to reflect upon the mizan, to reflect upon a balance. And so even when we talk about a human being, a just human being, we say insanun mawzun. What is a person who's a mawzun? It's a balanced human being. A balanced human being, by definition, is an ethical human being. Is a person who is equanimous, in a state of equanimity, a person who is not taken to excessiveness at one level or another. You can't use insan mawzoon in a negative context. Try to find an entire corpus of Arabic poetry, an insan mawzoon in a negative context, you will not find it. Now, this has opened, our ancestors used to take the Quran much more seriously than we do. And they reflect it at great length. And in fact, I would submit to you that someone like Qadi ibn Abdul Jabbar, in his entire huge corpus, the 14 volumes in some print or 12 volumes that he's written on taklif, what sparks his thinking about ethics of a balanced human being and what a balance within a human being means. Qadi Abdul Jabbar has a passage, that work is not read by modern Muslims nearly enough, and if modern Muslims cared about their tradition, you would find tons and tons and tons of studies of someone like Qadi Abdul Jabbar. But there are few studies, and many of them are written by non-Muslims. But one of the most fascinating things he says is that by reflecting on mizan, on this earth, on the nature of ethics within human beings on this earth, you will come to the realization that of the imperative of the mizan in the hereafter. That if you truly think about ethics and the nature of ethics in this world, you will naturally come to the logical conclusion that there must be consequence and there must be a mizan that will follow the mizan of this earth. Now, again, so many things you can talk about, but this also goes back to something that Grace mentioned at the very beginning. That when Muslims try to imagine that a human being, can have a state of ethics that is defined in a completely parochial and exceptional way, that is against the very nature of creation. In other words, the ethics that exist for a Muslim are the same ethics that exist for a non-Muslim. Because the nature of the balance that we perceive intuitively is the same. There's a lot written about that. But Abu Bakr, the companion, radiallahu anhu, says, and as I said, our ancestors used to take the Quran much more seriously than we do. They reflected on why the mizan of those who attain salvation is heavy, while the mizan of those who do not attain salvation is light. I have never seen a modern Muslim even articulate that idea. Put it differently, a lot of Muslims think that the way things are going to work is that in the scale you put the sins, and when the sins outweigh the non-sins or good deeds, but that's contrary to what the Quran says. In fact, what the Quran says is that the scales are made heavy by good deeds. And there is a very interesting discussion about, well, what exactly goes in these scales? What makes the scales heavy as opposed to light? And Abu Bakr attributed to him, whether in fact he said this or not is a different matter, but it's attributed to him, and it engages the commentaries quite a bit. حق لميزان لا يوضع فيه إلا الحق أن يكون ثقيلا. And the translation is, it cannot be but true for a mizan, for a balance, in which truth is placed but to be heavy. Now, the idea here is that truth, by its nature, it's what's weighty. Truth is what weighs something. And because of the weighty nature of truth, it is what will weigh heavily in the mizan. Now, Imam al-Jilani comments on this by reminding us that the Quran tells us that a sin will count as what? One. A good deed counts as what? 10. By its nature, what you seek, what you desire, is for your good deeds to weigh down the mizan. Left from Ibn Taymiyyah this time. Ibn Taymiyyah says, imagine a person who does nothing but refrain from committing sins, but has not done a good deed in his entire life. Would that person have a weighty scale or a lighter scale? And Ibn Taymiyyah says, well, it would be a lighter scale because affirmative good deeds is what weighs down the mizan. This goes to, in what we call today, the point of apathy. It's consistent with if your prayer does not transform your character, if your prayer does not make you into a merciful person, does not make you into a giving person, a person that gives sadaqah and zakah, does not make you into a kind human being. What is a Muslim? The Prophet ﷺ tells us a Muslim is a person, man salima an-nas min lisan wa yadu, right? The person that does not hurt human beings either through his tongue or his hands. That's a good deed, that you don't hurt people. Now, if you are apathetic, you do not care about a realization of goodness, then there is an issue. Now, remember that also the Prophet ﷺ said, Al-Hasanat yuzhibna as-sayyi'at. By the nature of things, what the good deeds will erase the bad deeds. So, it is as if the good deeds are of what is of substance, and they have a negating power on bad deeds. So if you are wise, if you are smart, you will do as many good deeds as possible to erase as many bad deeds as possible. They're worth 10 times more. They negate the bad deeds. So if you've done things that are bad in your life, the way you fix that is not by sitting in a corner and saying, God forgive me, but by doing affirmative good deeds. To put it in terms that you would be more accustomed to, if you don't feed the poor and take care of the orphan and don't care about what happens to others, you've got a problem. As the Prophet ﷺ, another bit, and all of this is just from the different commentaries and the way that I keep telling you that our ancestors took the Quran far more seriously than we do. The way that they unpacked levels of morality from just a few surahs or a few ayat. أثقل شيء يوضع في الميزان. The heaviest thing that is placed in the mizan, in the balance, in the hereafter, this is a hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, is what? Husnul khulq, ethical character. Now, if contemporary Muslims just reflected on that, I mean, this is what drives you insane. All the myopia, all the literalism, all the legalism, all the orthopraxy. If you simply reflected on the fact that your Prophet ﷺ tells you that the heaviest thing that will be placed in the scales, Allah tells you, مَنْ ثَقُلَتْ مَوَازِينُهُ فَهُوَ فِي عِيشَةٍ رَاضِيَةٍ. Those whose scales are going to be heavy, they're going to be in a state of repose. And then that's what Allah tells you. Now the Prophet comes and tells you the heaviest thing that is going to be placed in the scales is good moral character. Husnul khuluq. Good ethical character. Can you define good ethical character non-contextually?
No.
Let me illustrate that. This is actually I am stealing, or I am borrowing something I learned from Sheikh Muhammad al-Ghazali. Reflect upon curse words. When you say a bad word, a swear word is defined linguistically, right? Epistemologically. How do we know something is a bad or obscene word? It's defined by the language used by a people. There is no other way for us to identify a swear word from a non-swear word. If I say something, if I want to cuss you out, I'm using usage, linguistic usage. That is just one illustration in the way that husnul khuluq, good moral character, is defined by usage. Even generosity, from the lack of generosity, karam, is defined contextually. Because if someone comes, knocks at the door and says, I'm hungry, and every single one of you, your customary practice is to give them $100. And then my giving them $100 no longer becomes generosity. It just becomes a standard. In order to be generous, I have to exceed the common usage. The moral value is generosity, is exceeding the common usage in giving. But what is the common usage? That's defined in fancy language, that's defined epistemologically, meaning through usage and formulation of meaning in a place and time. Some of the most mind-blowing things you can read, not modern philosophers, on this particular point, Qadi Abdul Jabbar. Because Qadi Abdul Jabbar tells us, now of course, I'm sure some people listen to this Halaqa, the people who usually love to attack and say, oh, he's a Mu'tazili. Why does he always mention a Mu'tazili? I do not disown any part of the Islamic tradition. As long as a scholar convinces me, I will cite him. Mu'tazili, Ash'ari, Maturidi, Sufi, what I care about is the intellectual content that the scholar presents. And Qadi Abdul Jabbar told us that truth on this earth, other than some basic truths that are divine in nature, truths like particles in our modern physics do not obtain a reality, a location, unless perceived by a human being. So in other words, to speak about truth on most matters in abstract form without the perception of a human being is a fallacy. This is what Qadi Abdul Jabbar says. And so is the nature of justice. We can talk about philosophy till no end, but we're taking this is not philosophy, this is common sense. So when interestingly, I mean, when Grace says you can't leave your common sense outside the door, because you live within a context. You have a duty to, we said it before, what is it, fierce moral inventory? Fearless moral inventory. You have a duty to constantly scrutinize yourself within a fearless moral inventory of your own behavior and the behavior of the society that exists in. But do not imagine that you define justice out of the literalism of a text without its contextual reality. Because that's how human beings perceive everything and construct meaning. Okay, a lot that you could say about the nature of the mizan and the weightiness of the mizan and the nature of good deeds, but one of the things that a lot of commentators point to is one of the great scholars, or very early, he's from the Tabi'een, Abdul Aziz bin Yahya, often repeated when reciting this verse. He would teach his student the following: Al-lisanu waznul insan, that the tongue is the balance of a human being. What Abdul Aziz bin Yahya meant by this is to remind his students that a human being that aspires to weigh heavily in the scales in the hereafter is a human being who watches his tongue. Now this, by the way, and Abdul Aziz bin Yahya often would mention this. He would read وَيْلٌ لِكُلِّ هُمَزَةٍ لُمَزَةٍ at the same time that he would read Al Qaria. Remember, وَيْلٌ لِكُلِّ هُمَزَةٍ لُمَزَةٍ we've talked about. And what Humazat al-Lumza talks about is those who wag their tongues talking about people and deconstructing people and criticizing human beings, etc., etc. We've talked about that. And Abdul Aziz bin Yahya would often remind his students that unless you watch your tongue, you will end up weighing slightly in the scales of the hereafter. Okay, let me see if I forgot anything. No, okay. Now, of course, what correlates is the juxtaposition that we're accustomed to in Quranic construction, that whatever the good, we're told about the good, we're told about the other side, and the other side are those whose scales will be light. They don't have many good deeds in their scales. And we know that the consequence is bad. We know that. But we pause at the expression ummuhu hawiyah. Why do we pause there? We pause there because that's what our ancestors paused at as well. Translated here, Sharif, what's your translation say? Ummuhu hawiyah.
That's verse 9?
Yes.
Will have his home in a bottomless pit.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. Yeah, here my translation all says will have the bottomless pit for his home, which is, again, I mean, yes, it's true. But why did it detain our forefathers? The expression ummuhu hawiyah is figurative. Why ummu? Ummu comes from the word what?
Mother.
Mother, right? Ummi is my mother. Is a mother. So it's as if saying his mother is in a bottomless pit. Well, no. So it's a figurative expression. Now, interestingly, the word the reason it's pre-Arabic. It's in Aramaic as well. If I remember my Aramaic from the days of Princeton. Yeah, it is. But anyway, is the reason a mother is called an is an of a shay is something that you are directed towards. But you're not directed towards out of slavish oppression. You're directed towards out of attraction and a sense of repose and tranquility. That is why it becomes your home. So, shay is something that, and that's why the word ummah or an ummah is supposed to be, the reason it's a nation, or ummat al-Muslimin, is supposed to, or even when you say imam, right? An imam is someone that you are directed behind. Shay is something you are directed towards, but you're not directed towards out of oppression, you're directed towards out of attraction and a sense of repose. Second level of meaning is that you're directed towards out of a sense of repose to the point that it becomes your homestead. Now, figuratively, and especially in Arabic poetry, as Akrama said about this particular verse, before we get to Akrama, in Arabic usage, part of the body that is described as, that you can refer to as is this part of the forehead. So that you say ra'sih, or when you say so as hawa ala ra'sih, someone fell down, literally it means it fell down on his forehead, but figuratively it means what? For the Arabic knowers here, hawa ala ra'sih, he tumbled down head, what is that expression?
Head first?
Like head first, or turned over, upside down. But if you are using it literally, it means that you fall down on your forehead. Now, so in Arabic poetry, often the place of honor is the forehead. That's why if you really want to insult someone in a different culture, you slap them on this part of the forehead. That's a huge insult. Now, Ibn Arabi reflects upon this and says that the Arabs intuitively knew that this is where Mahal al-Nadar, this is where the third eye is. And that they understood. The other place, by the way, where you truly can insult someone is if you hit them at the back of the neck. There's a reason for that. We won't get into it. But it's if you, and even it extended to among the Andalusians, that if you slap someone at the front of their forehead, that was sometimes a cause for bloodshed. People would remember that for generations. As bad as if you slap someone on the face. Some of the very early opinions of Islamic law is whether if a husband smacks his wife on the front of the forehead, whether that's an automatic cause of divorce or not. Now, of course, in our modern age, I don't think you should if a husband slapped his wife on the front of the forehead, I don't think she would understand why the hell she did it. You know what I'm saying? Are you insane? What's wrong with you? In another age, it's unforgivable insult. But in Quranic usage, now remember what we said about this part in sujood? There is no more powerful way to say that a human being is doomed than to say Hawiya. It's as if you're saying, literally, the mother of your head is doomed. If that's a terrifying image. It's like saying, those who have had any encounter of the demonic, they will always use one expression to describe it. They will say, I experienced utter hopelessness. Now, put the surah together. You start out with intense anxiety because reality is changing in front of you. The mountains are becoming like thread, like fiber. What could be more terrifying than that? Now, what do you want after that gripping state of fear? If you are in a state of grace, you experience tranquility and repose. If you're not in a state of grace, your fear only intensifies further as you experience this utter state of hopelessness expressed through Ummuhu Hawiyah. That same, when the Quran tells us that in the hereafter, those who did not pray will be invited or will be called upon to do sujood and will not be able to. They will be called upon to bring that area of the forehead down in submission to Allah, but they will not be able to. And figuratively meaning what? In an utter state of hopelessness and fear. Now, if you obtain the grace of Allah, that fear is replaced with repose and tranquility. If you don't obtain the salvation of Allah and the grace of Allah, that state of fear leads to a most terrifying result. Narun Hamir is searing hellfire. Now, there is some fascinating material that we can get into later because we'll encounter it again elsewhere. If you look at even some of the translations, like the Study Quran, actually, and you read the footnote in the Study of the Quran, it will tell you that the expression narun hamia, well, we know that the nature of nar is what? Fire, right? The nature of fire is that it's hot. So why do you need to say hamia in describing a fire? I told you our ancestors took the Quran much more seriously than we do. And our ancestors reflected upon this at length. Why would the Quran say nar hamia? Why would it describe the fire as, you could translate it as blazing, you can translate it as searing, you can translate it as ultimate. Hima shay is the epitome of something, the most intense level of something. And hima nar is the hottest part of fire, the most searing part of fire. Now, the part that I told you, you can, and the Study Quran tells you in a footnote a little bit about why it is a fire of the most searing kind. That's the part that you can read in a footnote of the Study Quran. The part that I told you we can get into later because we'll revisit it is, does the fire that is described in hell necessarily have to be the fire that we know in this existence? We know that it sears skins, we know that it burns, but does it have to have the same properties of fire that we know in the physics of this world? The answer is Short answer is no. But why and how do we get there, that's the part we'll leave till later. Because there are other surahs that allow us to have a fuller discussion than this one. I want to share with you what al-Maturidi. The al-Maturidi is the eponym of the theological school of thought known as al-Maturidiyya. The same Maturidi. He has a famous tafsir on the Quran. And what he wrote on Surah al Qaria caught my attention. And I thought that as we conclude this, I share it with you. I'll first read it in Arabic and then I'll translate it. He wrote, طبيعة النشأة الأولى. طبيعة النشأة الأولى هي لاكتساب المعارف والحقائق الكاملة بمطاوى التكاليف الإلهية والسرائر الربانية ولأوامره وأحكامه. والنشأة الثانية هي للجزاء المترتب على تلك المعارف والحقائق العقلانية. Says that the first existence, النشأة الأولى, the first emergence, its very nature هي الاكتساب, so that we human beings will attain knowledge of truth, obligations, and divine natures. السرائر is not secrets, but the true nature of things. And the second existence, the hereafter, must necessarily follow as a jaza, as a consequence of the first. So that in proportion to your attainments in the first existence will be your fate in the second existence. The reason I wanted to share this with you is that I always believed that the reason the earlier Muslims created an entire civilization, that energetic impetus in them that made them create a civilization, is simply because they took this to heart. It's as if Islam lit a fire under them. Under them, if the hereafter, the consequence of the hereafter, if I attain knowledge of truth, values, ethics, justice in its levels, that's what will weigh heavily in the hereafter. And if to the extent of my attainment on this earth is what will happen in the hereafter, because I often reflect upon what made these earlier Muslims sit there and become obsessed with Greek knowledge and Persian knowledge and every type of form of knowledge, at least for a number of centuries, until that fire started to dim. What made them obsessed with investigating everything from the nature of optics and lights or the stars to the nature of truth, justice, philosophy, theology, kalam, so on. What made them produce all these tons of volumes of intellectual reflections and spiritual explorations? They truly believed, as they sat there writing their investigations, writing their literary corpus, that they were working towards their hereafter. Something that we, I think, miss in modern Muslims. greatly. For some reason, there's a disconnect between our here and now and their hereafter, because I cannot imagine, if you truly believe that there is going to be a hereafter, can you explain to me in God's name, Billah, explain to me, how can you go to a convert, a woman or a man that just converted, came to Islam, and then not only, okay, you marry them, but instead of making them fall in love more with Islam, you abuse them and you use hadith and Quran in ways to serve your own desires and instincts and tell them this is what God wants from them. How would that be possible if you truly believe that the hereafter is coming and that there is a bill to pay? I am convinced that for whatever period of time we engage in disassociative dissonance, we become in a disassociated state where even if we do our salah, our prayer, or we fast and so on, we truly do not believe that there is going to be a bill to pay. And if we did, I cannot imagine. Same thing, by the way, was a lot of people who commit terrorism. I mean, how can you blow up people? You know, you see children playing around and you go blow them up. And somehow you convince yourself there's not going to be a bill to pay. Or that somehow this is indeed not a haqq, that this is a haqq that's going to weigh heavily in the scales. What the theme that I find in many of the writings other than Ahl al-Hadith, because Ahl al-Hadith were very mechanical and dogmatic in their approach, is reflecting upon the seriousness of that final moment and its consequences. I'll close with this, and this is not from me, this is from an Imam al-Jilani. He would conclude his own commentary. Tafsir al-Jilani was written by his students. His students took what he said about his Quran and wrote down his observations and comments, and that's how we have the Tafsir al-Jilani. We don't have a manuscript copied from Jilani's own writings. We have manuscripts from what his students said he said in his Halaqa. So he would close on a Qaria was this, according to his students. الركون إلى الملذات الروحانية بدل الجسدية هو مبتغانا إياكم وإياكم الأماني وطول الأمل فإنها توقع في فتنة وبلية لا نجاة منها. He would tell his students, our goal is malazat is the enjoyments of what? The spiritual enjoyments instead of the bodily enjoyments. For every person who commits an injustice against another, if only they would have realized the beauty of spiritual enjoyments instead of bodily enjoyments, so much evil would be avoided in our existence. إياكم وإياكم الأماني. He's warning his students, be very careful against, what is amani? Wishfulness. Yeah, that's actually wishfulness. That your attitude towards God would be to take God for granted and to say God will just forgive me. وطول الأمل فإنها توقع في فتنة وبلية لا نجاة منها. That it will make you fall in a fitna, meaning a ill deeds, and calamity, and you will not be able to extract yourself from it. That often, very often, unless you're evil, when we do things we shouldn't do, is because we assume that, well, God will forgive it, God will overlook it. And that's what he's warning his students against. And it just caught my attention that that's the way he would close, or that's the way he closed his Halaqa on Surah al Qaria. And I'm a believer in tradition, so in his tradition, that's the way I close this Halaqa as well. Thank you. Okay, no, don't clap. Just say alhamdulillah. Okay, shall we do, yeah, short Q&A.
6:42 now, so.
Okay, so we said we'll finish at 7, so.
Yeah, so going back, I actually have a few questions. People don't end up having questions, but going back to the earlier topic of why extramarital sex is a sin. For a lot of things that are prescribed in our religion, it also just makes intuitive sense why they are prescribed. But for that, if it's done in like an intentional way or a monogamous way or a way that like it would be fine when you do your fearless moral like inventory, if it weren't prescribed, I guess I'm looking for a more like thorough or reasoned or like jurisprudential or whatever answer for why it's inconsistent with like having a good relationship with the divine.
Did you want to go ahead and have your other questions
Yeah,
too? So
sure.
let's just throw some out there.
I was just curious if you wanted to go back to some of the things that you said we'd discuss later, like why the base of the scalp is a place that's important, like the third eye, and the like effect that English has when it's spoken that's distinct from the effects that like Aramaic and Hebrew have. And then another question that I had, so we talked in the last halaqa about how salat sort of mirrors the cycle of death and the hereafter. So in this halaqa we talked about how that moment of the like thunderous calamity is accompanied by a feeling of anxiety. Does that mean that like in salat it's okay to expect or experience like a tinge of anxiety when you're praying? Did you have a question, Sam? Just to throw it out there.
Sure. You talked about, doing 2 rak'ah in various situations, one of them being if you're angry. And I'm curious to understand how that's possible, because when I'm angry, admittedly, I don't think I have space in myself for God, because I'm so consumed with my anger. And so to think about stopping at that moment and praying 2 rak'ah seems very near impossible. So some sort of guidance on that, or thoughts on that.
Let's stop there and then we'll go to the next round.
Some of these questions, there is so much that we can talk about when it comes to the least familiar part of our tradition, which are the energies of the body and existence, and which admittedly, used to be taken far more seriously. And like modern Muslims, this is a side note. It bothers me to no end that all the great physics scientists of modernity are not Muslim. Because if Muslims still had that part of the tradition, they would be obsessed with physics and chemistry. But like so many things, they would be obsessed with astronomy. So some of them will have to return to them, or have separate sessions dedicated to them. I would encourage some of you, or all of you, or people who are hearing me, because some have said that they would like to do something like that amongst themselves, to create sort of working groups for Salah, and to work on prayer together, because you'll discover a great deal the more you practice it. And the more you practice it together and compare notes and talk to each other with transparency and honesty, because that would also open the door to sharing different levels of knowledge about it. Some things you can comment on in response to an experience, but you cannot comment on in the abstract. So I wanted to put that out there. I'm going to take the last first, maybe because I still remember it. The salah. To get accustomed to try to deal with your problems through salah. In other words, to treat ailments through prayer in itself is very difficult. I mean, when you first started, no question that the time that you really don't feel like praying is the time when you are most anxious, or you are most angry, or you're most bored. By our nature, we don't think of prayer as particularly entertaining if I'm bored, or if I'm anxious, worried about. The only time that prayer might come naturally to us if we're in a disaster, or we're worried about a loved one, or our child is sick, or then Allah, please, then we might really pray and concentrate. That's in more language that we're accustomed to. That's from shaitan, the nature of things. So when you first start forcing yourself to do it, it feels alien and it feels strange. But I would tell you that in the same way that you take, as the Prophet ﷺ tells us, you take one step towards Allah, Allah takes 10 steps towards you. If you persist, you will be amazed at the divine, and you will feel it. And this is something I've seen time and time again with people who persisted. The way that Allah comes to your aid, the way that you could go from anxiety and anger to saying Allahu Akbar and you find that anger melting away is... Now, I'm not saying it's easy, but to force yourself to do it, and expect it to first, and don't be discouraged with failures, because shaitan, there are times, when you're angry, in a very literal sense, the time when you are most open to the demonic, and I don't believe in the shaitan figuratively. I believe not one shaitan, but shayateen, al-ins wal jinn, both. I believe in them literally. The most you are open to the demonic is when you are angry. And also when you engage in excessive behavior, like drinking, taking drugs, eating to excess. That's when you open yourself to the demonic. So, logically, if you want to treat the demonic, that's the time you need the divine the most. Because you're truly, when we are angry, part of us opens a portal to the demons. Or if someone is drinking alcohol, or taking drugs. And that's when they need God the most. Our nature, though, because the demonic calls upon us to do that, is that at the moment when we need the divine the most, tells us God doesn't want you. You are disgusting, you are gross, God doesn't want to even look at you. That's a fallacy of the shaitan. That is the greatest deception of the shaitan. This is when you must absolutely turn to Allah, force yourself to turn to Allah. No human being, and Let me say that. You meet certain people and they have a serenity about them. They're not quick to anger, and no one is born this way. No one is born this way. Like everything, it takes persistence and hard work. And just remember, at the moments that you are most open to the demonic is the moments where you need the divine the most. And there is no such thing, as Allah told us, that it is only the most foolish or inequitous that despair in the divine mercy. So there's no such thing as God doesn't want you at this moment, or you're too disgusting to God. Okay, let me take the issue of extramarital sex, because throughout, not just modern Muslims, but throughout history, that has always been an issue. And remarkably, we don't realize how much has been written about this. There is one book that is actually written in English, which used to be a PhD dissertation. If you could find it, read it. Theory of Love in Hanbali Islam. Some smart graduate student, this was back in the 70s, I think. But it's books that is printed on order, so you can still get it, or you probably find it in the library as well. I have a copy of it, of course. It just comes to mind because it's a little exposure, one of these few studies in English that's a little exposure on how much has been written about love and sex and the regulation of sexuality and the regulation of sex. Because we know that at the time of the Islamic revelation, sex in Catholicism had already existed, and sex in Judaism, in other words, discourses on sex in the Catholic tradition were already in existence, and whether sex by its nature is good or bad or evil or not evil and so on. And in Judaism and also in the Greek tradition already existed, and in the Persian tradition as well, the Assyrian tradition. And so Muslims were not writing on a clean slate. They were writing on a slate that already existed. Now, so because the answer I can give in this context is by its nature incomplete, because it could be a much larger topic. Having said now, there is a great amount of discussion about why the regulation of sexuality and with why the Sharia Sharia or within the Islamic tradition. We all know that sex is not seen as a dirty thing by its nature, unlike Catholicism, for instance, or an original Christian theology, and it's not seen as evil by its nature. Having said that, though, and you are told often that the reason that sexuality is controlled is because of unwanted pregnancies and things like that, and I don't think that that's right. That's a right answer. I think that the reason, and here I'm telling you what I think. What I think that the reason that sexuality, or that Allah controls sexuality, anytime, and this is an unusual response, but bear with me. Anytime we engage the fluids of the body, ejaculation in particular, climax, we are at a very heightened point of energy. It's a point of great power that could take you upwards or take you downwards. It is as if it's a moment of intoxication and loss of rationality. Your intellectual faculties become suspended, but it also has an enormous impact and power of the energies of our body and even the energies around us. I told you before that whether you pray or not shows in your aura. And again, I know that, for modern Muslims, you don't know, how modern Muslims are not accustomed to hearing this stuff. So I'm taking a risk. I'm like saying, I can't. What also affects a person's aura is the type of sexual relations they engage in. Whenever you are with another person, the energy of anyone is mixed with the energy of that human being. You don't just exchange molecules, you also exchange energy. It's like, in particle physics, when you dye a particle, its parallel particle, if they both came from the same particle and splits through a prism, and if you dye one, the other one becomes automatically dyed. We don't understand why it happens, but that's what happens in quantum physics. Human auras are like that. Now, it's a point of a human being that engages with partners without commitment. Their entire aura becomes as if messy and blotchy and dark. From that level of spirituality, I start understanding why Allah wanted us to commit and to have set partners. It is as if our very nature and our very creation is not made for us to jump from one partner to the other. The thing that creates confusion in marriage is that the modern state thoroughly regulates the institution of marriage. The modern state tells you it's not your community, it's not your family that defines whether what we require of a relationship is that it would be public and that it would be known and that there would be an exchange of vows and a commitment. So that if people leave each other, you're creating an expectation in the community, because commitment is a social project. So you're creating within the entire communal structure an expectation of commitment and an expectation of obligation and the idea and an expectation of faithfulness. And that is why I'm also opposed to men marrying and divorcing left and right, because it completely goes against that communal expectation of commitment and obligation and faithfulness, which is completely undermined when husbands or men marry in secret, for instance, or say we can take a second wife in secret, because all of that undermines the entire enterprise if you understood what marriage is all about. The part that I have not come to, we know that it's only a modern phenomenon that the state becomes involved in registering marriages. All jurists that I know of have said, well, the only marriages that count today in our modern age are the marriages that are recognized by the state. from a philosophical point of view and a theological point of view, that is not a sufficient answer. From a legal point of view, I completely understand it, because you want the state to regulate, or you expect the state, but the state regulating marriages is a modern phenomenon that has not been justified theologically or philosophically. To be very clear, because I don't want anyone to go around saying Khaled Abou El Fadl said, I am not telling people it's okay to go sleep around and not get married. I am talking about you must approach this as a historian, as a sociologist, and as a philosopher. That, leave alone as a lawyer. As a lawyer, we say, okay, yeah, the state should regulate. As a historian, we understand the progression in human societies where the state becomes sort of their mother and father. The state decides when they're born, the state decides when they're dead, the state decides when they're married. Right? You're not born until the state gives you a birth certificate. You're not dead until the state gives you a death certificate. And you're not married until the state says you're married. Now, theologically and philosophically, I can defend the idea that the community must recognize that you're born, married, and dead. But I can't defend theologically and philosophically the state should recognize when you're born, married, and dead. I'm not telling people go sleep around. I'm telling them, again, because Muslims have a tendency to go around accusing you of all types of things. Saying that is a question to be answered. That is something that needs further exploration. Commitment, I can justify commitment morally. And I can justify vows and the exchanging of vows morally. I can even see it in the aura of people. People who sleep around, you can bring me someone, I can tell you whether they have extramarital sex or they don't have extramarital sex simply by looking at their aura. All of that experience and theology has convinced me of. The part that I have not understood, let's put it that way instead of convinced of, that I have not comprehended, maybe because I'm not smart enough, is the role of the state. Someone smarter than I needs to come and explain to me the role of the state. You understand what I'm saying? Okay.
No.
No?
No.
Yes and no. I understand what you're saying legally, but I don't think that the question is.
Okay, so can we leave the state out of the
Yeah,
question?
So I think the question, what's the
Okay.
answer theologically and philosophically and Islamically?
Well, it wasn't the question about what the difference between marriage and just being in a committed relationship, even
Right.
if that's extramarital, versus because then the difference is there's a big difference between someone who's in a committed relationship but not married, whether under the state
What
or
I'm
not,
saying,
and someone who's just
okay, so what
on
I'm saying
Tinder
then,
hooking up every
Yeah.
two seconds.
so what I'm saying then is that marriage, it's exchanging of vows and it being a public relationship. Because the secrecy in a relationship, having it erodes the role and the value of obligation in communal values. That's what I'm saying. And we see this in not just in our society, but even in pre-Islamic societies. Societies that have accepted relationships outside of exchanging of vows, and a community recognizing that these two are these are a couple. When communities have the very value of obligations in relationships eroded. And we see this sociologically in a repeated pattern. And what I'm also saying is that experience have also shown me, and this is not just my observation, is that it's as if Allah has created us by nature that, if you want to call it energy force, our auras, that we become confused human beings. The more confused we are, more confused the more partners we have, and especially if these partners are fly-by-night partners. The psychology and test my theory. People who sleep around, engage them intellectually and psychologically, and compare them to people who do not sleep around, and examine the clarity of their thinking and the clarity of their common sense and the clarity of their ability to articulate and feel values.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah.
Additionally, when people get married, it's holy matrimony, so it's done under God, or
Yeah.
and much
Thank
like
you.
the transformation of reality, going from I'm committed to this person to husband and wife is a complete transformation of the relationship. Husband and wife are there for each other
May
unconditionally.
Allah bless you for saying this, because I got into all the rational stuff and I left the most important part out. Allah describes the vow in the Quran as mithaqan ghaliza, and this is a lot, especially a lot of Muslim men forget. That the vow that you exchange with your spouse is a covenant with God. And I gave a whole halaqa on the marriage halaqa, and there are two types of marriages. There are marriages in which two people marry each other, and there is a marriage in which two people marry each other and their third partner is God. And listen to the marriage halaqas about it. It's a very different dynamic, and having the third partner as God is when you take that covenant very seriously and you decide from the beginning that God will be the third partner in your relationship. It's a very different relationship, and thank you, Amanda, because it is, I mean, unfortunately, there are a lot of people that exchange vows that God never enters. So a lot of people write me and say, you know, I'm in love with this guy or in love with that guy, and my parents don't want to marry. And usually it's a non-Muslim. They want to marry Christian or you know, someone that's not a Muslim. And my response is always, well, it's up to you. Do you want God to be a third partner in your relationship or not? That's something that is between you two, and you decide. So are there a lot of people married who are married legally but not theologically? Yes. Is it possible to be married theologically but not legally? The lawyer in me cringes at the thought. This is what we call, you know, what they call in common law habitat, and there's actually an equivalent in Islamic law as well, that two people have lived together so long they can't produce witnesses anymore. They have no witnesses, but the community have always known them as together. If they mean to make God their third partner, then it's a marriage. But I mean, modern human beings, they remind me a lot of what I read about sexuality in the Roman Empire and the Greek Empire, where people are into relationships are far more about sex than the spirit. And spiritual relationships, they're a very serious investment, and listen to the marriage holocaust. Okay.
I think we have two last questions.
You know, wait, you asked something else with that. One that I was going to put. Huh?
Back of the head.
Yeah, let's
power.
postpone that. But I'll tell you very quickly. There's not just a center of energy here, of course. and there's a center of energy here, and there's a center of energy here, at least in the Islamic tradition. And the at the front part, it is sustainer of life. At the part, at least in the Islamo-Arab / Turkish / Persian tradition / Indian tradition, and at the back part is a sustainer of honor. So you even the expression someone walk with, we say an angel with your head tall. This actually comes from the Islamic tradition. You stand with your neck held up. That means your dignity upright, and the way you work on your sense of dignity is by visualizing the energy moving from the back of your neck to the front of your neck, back and forth in a pulsation. So some of my teachers, when they used to notice timid kids are coming in and they're like, and they say everything, they're not sure of themselves, and their exercise would be you sit in zikr and you visualize the luminous substance that is back and forth in the area of your neck from front to back. Your ability to understand and perceive. Now, of course, there's a whole big deal about what's on sort of ras, which is the top of the head, but that's a very big topic. I have to admit that I've very poorly read in anything but the Islamic tradition on that field, so I know that non-Muslims talk about chakras, but I've never read anything about that. So I don't know how it compares if any of you guys.
And there was the question about the power of the English language, but we can do that.
What was the question?
You had just mentioned in passing that you were saying Arabic, the language has a power, and English has a different kind of power. And I think that was the question.
Yeah. No, but all languages, I mean, and this is, all languages have a creation power. Remember that creation came out of the Word. God, all of creation came out of the divine Word. And the divine Word, I write about the conference about this, but I write in sort of in a hidden way a little bit. And for those who've read a lot about this material, to understand exactly what I'm talking about. But you can, the word is creation. And the Hebrew, with the letters in Hebrew, with the numerical values of letters, is a very powerful language. Arabic is a very powerful language. They have an impact on our environment. I can't tell you why Allah chose Arabic for the Quran, except that Allah tells us that they say, when Allah is talking to the critics of Muhammad, why did he choose Arabic? He could have chose an Ajami tongue. Ajami is the non-Arabic tongue. And if Allah would have chosen an Ajami tongue, they would have said, why did he pick an Ajami tongue? Why didn't he pick Arabic? So in this, the meaning is that Allah could have chosen any language. And the how Arabic differs from Hebrew, differs from English in their powers, that's something we'll talk about later. I can even tell you some stuff you can read about that if you're interested. But languages are a powerful thing. Letters are a powerful thing. And you affect your environment by what you articulate. And that's, by the way, why you should either read Quran out aloud in your home or turn on Quran in our modern technology out aloud in your home, because it affects the environment in your home. It cleanses the environment in your home, and it protects the environment in your home. And a home that doesn't have Quran in it is a vulnerable home.
So I think Audit and Kat had last questions.
Go ahead.
In addition to coming together collectively to improve our salat, what can we do on an individual level?
Most important, I've touched upon this before, but dhikr individually is very important to start reflecting upon what areas does your soul call for. Because some of you, when you do dhikr, you'll discover that what your soul really calls for the most is that you want to understand. For instance, some of you will become fascinated, or you find your soul, that your soul will be satisfied if you truly understand the secrets of letters and language of the Quran, for instance. And that becomes an entire journey that will take you your entire life. Other people will be drawn by the philosophic tradition. Other people will, if you're unlucky, you'll be drawn by the legal tradition. That's closing of the mind, and law has its own limits. It is the calling of the soul that, and other people truly find their beauty and their aura in taking care of the orphans or working among the poor. The problem is all of us, especially in our modern age, we're placed on trajectories and shot like rockets towards goals and ends, and we don't pause to look inwards and reflect upon what the energy that Allah has created in our soul, and what that soul is calling upon us to do, what we covet. And the coveting of the soul is the most urgent of passions. It cannot be quenched once you identify it, and once you decide to become balanced with it and at peace with it. Then you learn to listen to it and to not harshly suppress it and silence it the way we often do in our lives. So dhikr, working together in salah, I'm not, what pursuit of knowledge should follow that, not precede that. When people say, well, can we read a book together? And we are raised as modern human beings so reliant on our rational faculties that that's not what needs development. Maybe if we were born in a different age where our spiritual faculties are very heightened and our rational faculties are what needed work, I would tell you, well, what you really need to do is to get together and read books on logic. But we're in a very different age. And I've talked about this before in many contexts. The true faqih in our day and age is the one who understands the epistemology of the age and the deontology and ontological realities of the age that they live in. Those who spew out traditional knowledge without the moderate or the context in which they exist in, whatever that context is, whatever age it is, they're not a faqih, they're a jag, by the nature of the language itself. Because a faqih, a knowledgeable person, is a person who is submerged in the knowledge of their time. A jag is an ignorant person. Start with that. I mean, even dhikr can be done collectively. It's preferred to be done individually, because being alone is the very first form of companionship that you have to get used to. We are often very uncomfortable with ourselves, and we get very restless if we're doing dhikr alone, and we don't like to sit by ourselves because we often don't like ourselves, and we're uncomfortable with ourselves, and we don't know why. To know yourself is to know your God. And the first step to knowing yourself is to start learning to be comfortable with yourself. And that's a journey. And most people, when they say they despair in it, is that they haven't really given it time. They try it a few times and they freak out, or they're bored out of their skull, or they become very anxious and run away. Oh, I remember you raised one really good point about prayer and that sense of anxiety, which I wanted to comment on because it's a really good point. It's a really good point because it's a lefta, as they used to call, to say it's a sort of a perceptive remark. You reminded me of Sheikh Eid, who used to say, when you do iqamah, استحضر جلالة الله, that when you stand up in prayer, bring to the fore the magnanimity of Allah, Jalalatullah. And واجعل في نفسك الرهبة, that make within yourself that sense of awe. And then you'd say that sense of awe doesn't call in you fear in the sense that the Ahl al-Hadith say that, oh, be just scared of hellfire. No, be in a state of tremor of the awesomeness of the presence you are standing before. So you're absolutely right that when we stand, part of that tremor with fear is that sense of anxiety, preceded that you sense before the repose of the sujood. So in fact, what we would practice in prayer is that to feel tranquility seep into our body while we are in sujood, and that's why we prolong sujood and not prolong iqamah as much. But as we stand, we are in the presence of rahbah, in presence of the sense of tremor or fear, anxiety, and then we try to train as we move from ruku' to sujood of trying to let the grace of Allah encompass us. And then we repeat the cycle again, because the same cycle that when we're first born, we are full of anxiety. Then we learn to a sense of repose in the bosom of our mother. And then we start growing and become teenagers and we're full of anxiety. And then hopefully as you get older, you get a sense of repose again. If you're lucky, you become more serene, you settle down. Our death is a moment that will be full of anxiety. If we're fortunate, right after death, what you hope will come to you is a sense of tranquility and repose again. That cycle is the mirror cycle that we try to remind ourselves of in the cycle of prayer. I'm happy you brought up this point. It's worth going over time for.
Sorry, before we go to audit, so online someone asked if you could recommend English language resources for the study of energy and any practical resources for effective
Dhikr, that's easy. Can you remind me to come up with a list for the dhikr? Energy is harder, but there are the best people that I know have written on it in English are Shitak and his wife Murata. There is a book called The Tao of Islam that's very good. Unfortunately, that these are the only people that I know of that have written in English. In Arabic, there are tons. But let me look back and see if I can remember anyone else. A lot of people, by the way, all the students of there's in the 60s and 70s and 80s, there was a large group of converts who tended to be academics, tend mostly to be professors, not exclusively, who were students. They were people who started studying Rumi, Hafiz, Ibn Arabi, and they converted to Islam through studying these figures, and they quickly realized that modern Muslims had lost that part of their tradition, so they formed an association, and they started writing books on Rumi and Ibn Arabi, like the Self-Disclosure of the Righteous, one of their books. I don't remember who wrote it. Do you remember who wrote the Self-Disclosure? I can bring the names of these professors. Among them was Shittik and Murata. They were mostly British and some Americans. They're also known for what Sayyid Hussein Nasr is among them. He's the only native Muslim that I know of who is among them. But they're the only people that I know of that started writing about that tradition in English. And what their writings are a gold mine for English speakers. Can you remind me to make a list of their names? Most of the writings are now out of print, but they're well worth getting and reading, and you will learn a great deal from the material they wrote.
What about Layla Bakhtiar?
Layla Bakhtiar is, her translation of the Quran is good. What I've read by her is very elementary, very simple. She doesn't scratch these deeper type of works unless she's written something that I don't know about. So I recommend her translation of the Quran. It's good. She's written very short works about Salah and things like that, but they usually never go beyond the very elementary, very basic. I don't know much about her as a person or as a scholar, for that matter. So I don't, that's all I can speak to. Khaled, do you have?
Yeah, I have a quick question. Regarding Jilani students about the conclusion of the Al Qaria.
The way he used to close his lesson with Qara?
Yes.
Yeah.
So my question is about the last part about be careful of your wishfulness of God Almighty. And I think the example you mentioned was like, God will simply forgive you if you do this and that sin, for example. Now I have a question, what about for someone who lives a life of full of sin? Would it be like something very simple, like gossiping, backbiting, or enjoying alcohol? And then
you never despair God's mercy, meaning that you never stop believing, or you never stop asking God for forgiveness. But what Jilani is talking about is the arrogant attitude that many have, where they do things that are wrong, and they know they're wrong, and they simply have the attitude, God is most forgiving, so God is just going to forgive it. That's the type of wishfulness he's talking about. Now, someone who asks God for forgiveness and continues committing sin, God knows the intentions. If they're taking God for granted, God knows it, and draw a parallel to a human being. How often can you take a person for granted before that person can stop forgiving you? Or before that person has a right to stop forgiving you? Think of your wife. You take your wife for granted once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, 10 times. The human beings take God for granted more times than a husband takes his wife or a wife takes her husband. We are more, I mean, I hope, unless you're an awful human being, we are more observant of our spouses and their feelings than we are towards God. And that's the type of attitude that Jilani is warning his students about. If you truly think of God and what God is, you would try your best. None of us are immune from error. But what is your attitude in committing an error? Is it one of defiance and saying, well, what's a big deal? God, effectively telling God, you should forgive it because it's no big deal. I am the way I am. Or is it one where one says, I truly feel regret in my heart and I truly try not to commit sin, but I do. And God, please forgive me. There's a completely different attitudes between these two.
So someone who, say, accidentally fall into relapse or whatever, that's still not yet a part that Jilani is doing.
Accidental, I mean, it is all, Allah knows your intentions. And whether you feel true regret and it's a true relapse, meaning you're being thoughtless, you're being insensitive, you're being weak, or whether it's defiance and arrogance. And accordingly is the sin. Defiance and arrogance is the biggest sin of all. While error and mistake, it's a smaller sin. It's not that it's not a sin, but it's a smaller sin. In the scale of things, it's a smaller sin. What one should always fight against, speaking from personal experience as a human being, no sin is more difficult to guard against than arrogance and defiance. Because arrogance is as natural to us as the ego. We, by our nature, are egotistical beings. And pummeling that ego into discipline, making a disciplined ego, is tough. Unless you're an angel, unless you're born an angel. That's for most human beings. If someone doesn't have a problem with an ego, they're very fortunate. Maybe they're like that kid that used to, the Sheikh had do the neck exercises because he lacked a sense of pride. That was an egoless kid. He just had no ego, and he needed his ego to be pumped up. He's now a medical doctor. He left the entire field, but he's actually a very good medical doctor.
Okay, we're over time.